We'd like to start tonight by really just an interview of who our speaker is going to be. So we're going to take 10 minutes or so and really get you, or allow you to understand where he's coming from. And I know when I speak in different places, or I have a speaker in and you don't know his background, there's not that much connection. So let's talk about it a little bit, Dave. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. Really appreciate your trek from West Virginia, God's country, to be here today. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, those kind of things.
First of all, thank you for having me. It was an enjoyable trip today. It wasn't that long from Morgantown. But I have a family of 5. As Pastor Whitmer mentioned, I'm originally from Charleston, West Virginia. I actually live right now in Morgantown, West Virginia, where your pastor is from, and actually work out of the church that he grew up in. But I have a wife, Jenny, have 3 children. My son Caleb is 11, my daughter Susanna is 9, and my daughter Sarah just turned 7. So they're at home. They couldn't make it this weekend. They regret that. But we're actually here about a year or so ago. I don't know how many of you remember us, but we were here previously, but it's good to be back.
Yeah, we are launching Cross Impact at the University of Delaware and a campus ministry. And you are a campus pastor. Tell us a little bit about how you got into that. I know that you didn't train for that as far as educationally originally, so tell us a little bit about that.
I went to college at West Virginia University. I claimed to be a Christian, grew up in a good church, but I'm not at all sure I really was. And so when I went off to college, I wanted to be an engineer just so I could make lots of money. I really didn't pray about it much and anything like that. I've always been a Mountaineer fan, so I wanted to go to West Virginia University. But making a very long story short, when I got to WVU, I got involved as a student with Campus Light Ministries, which is the ministry I currently work with. And the Lord really got a hold of my heart through that involvement, began to convict me. I knew the gospel, but I wasn't at all sure of my eternal destiny. I knew I was a sinner, and I eventually made sure of my salvation my freshman year there at WVU. And again, making a long story short, although I did get an engineering degree, by the time I was done, I felt like the Lord was calling me into the ministry. Surrendered to the ministry, went off to seminary, and since I was reached as a college student myself, I guess naturally I had a burden to reach others like myself. And I've been really working with campus ministries for 20 years since I finished my seminary degree. 5 years in Clemson, 12 years at Marshall University, and for the last 4 at WVU. So.
And as far as campus ministry, do you feel like the things that you're going to talk about concerning creationism is interconnected with things that students on the college level are thinking about, or how we talked earlier about how those two things go together? You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, obviously when you're dealing with college students, you're dealing with people who have a lot of questions, and people that are away from home for the first time, people are trying to determine their own worldview, they're no longer under their parents' authority, and certainly they're getting fed all kinds of stuff about evolution and their classes, and so you need to be ready to answer questions about this topic. I actually teach on this topic about every 4 years. I have a series that I do on Genesis 1 to 11 where I try to answer a lot of these questions and talk a lot about creation and evolution. And even outside of that, obviously when you're dealing with individual students, they have a lot of questions. And we need to be prepared to give answers as much as possible. So I think there's a lot of overlap that way.
I know that creationism is kind of, I don't want to say hobby, I don't want to undermine that in any way, but it's been a great pursuit and a study for you. How did you first get interested in that? I know the Lord has used you to speak in a lot of churches, in seminars about creationism. How did that desire first kindle in your heart?
Well, keep in mind, my undergrad degree was in engineering, so I always had sort of an interest in math and science and things like that. And so naturally, and I never personally believed in evolution, and fortunately I had a good foundation where I had been taught some things, and I've always been fascinated about how what we see in the realm of science, what we see in God's creation, confirms what we read in God's Word. And so I always had an interest in that, and I can remember even early during my seminary time, there was actually a seminar back in my hometown of Charleston, West Virginia. I didn't go home very much because it was a long way from Greenville, South Carolina to Charleston, West Virginia. But the Institute for Creation Research had a seminar with Ken Ham, Dwayne Gish, and John Morris. And I can still remember going to that. That was certainly early in the days of, the big emphasis of creation science. And I was just absolutely enthralled. I was just thrilled by what I heard and enjoyed it thoroughly, and that sort of whetted my appetite. And ever since then, I've been reading what I can, studying what I can. At one point, I attended something Answers in Genesis did called Creation College, which is sort of designed to train people how to talk about this topic and how to lecture on it and so forth. So it's just something I've been doing sort of on the side in addition to the campus ministry that I do primarily.
Working with young people in student ministry, in the last, 5-7 years, there's been a lot of conversation about intelligent design. Do you find that is something that opens the door more? Is the attitude of the student population, especially the unsaved student population at WVU, responsive towards at least the idea that there may be a creator? What's your opinion on that, especially with the attitude of the students?
Well, quite honestly, I think in our postmodern world, and this may sound odd, but I think the attitude of the majority of the students is total apathy. In other words, they don't think about it. They really don't think about where I came from or whether it's one or the other. I'm sure they think about it some, but it's not the thing probably on their mind. With postmodernism, it's kind of like you can believe whatever you want to believe and it doesn't really matter. So that's something that we really fight. But having said that, I think that all the students deep down, because the Bible makes it very clear God has put eternity in our hearts. And I think deep down we all have those questions. I think it has helped maybe somewhat. I would say the student population probably reflects the general population as far as the percentage of students that would accept a young earth position, and which is still, surveys say that there's still a good percentage of the American public, in spite of all the evolutionary propaganda that we've been fed for years and years and years, there's a good percentage of the American population still believes in a relatively young earth. And then there's another percentage that believes that God had some hand in it, but the earth's still very old. And then there's still a small percentage of blatant atheists. So I'd say the student population probably reflects the society as a whole.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a long answer to a short question.
Well, I know that you're going to answer a lot of questions, why you're here, and we're looking forward to that. We're looking forward to what you're going to present to us tonight and 3 times tomorrow. But I guess if I were to ask you, just starting out here, what are your goals for this seminar? What are your goals for us?
Well, I guess I would say there would be 2. Number 1, I would like for everyone that attends the seminar to go home and be able to say, I can trust the Word of God. I don't need to doubt it. I don't need to question it. I can believe it. I don't need to be ashamed of it. That the Bible is authoritative, and that's the bottom line. And then on top of that, I would hope that many in attendance would feel more comfortable in talking with others. Not that any of us will ever have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. But hopefully, as a result of attending these sessions, maybe some people would be better equipped. And even if they don't get all the answers here, maybe they'll be encouraged to go back to that table and buy some books or get a DVD or subscribe to a magazine where they can get more answers. And maybe this would whet their appetite for that.
That's great. We're going to get right into the first session. One thing I do want to mention, since he actually brought that up, that is our table as a church here. That is, Dave did not bring that. He has one publication on that he graciously brought. We bought those things for Answers in Genesis, and we are selling them for the exact cost that we got them for. What we don't sell, we're going to send back. That is kind of a help to you to do more study, homework that you can take with you. So the girls are in the back as cashiers. If you want to get anything, we make 0 money off of it. Dave makes 0 money off of it. It's just for you and for your learning. So let's get into the first session. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Once again, I'd like to thank Pastor Whitmer for inviting me. It is a privilege to be here with you. I call my sessions Creations Light. Our ministry is called Campus Light Ministries. Obviously, you're starting a Cross Impact Ministry. We're more or less a sister organization. Our logo is a lighthouse, just like you have for your church here. But since our ministry is called Campus Light, I have called these seminars Creations Light because I think it does indeed reflect the light of the Creator. All right, about who He is. And even in the Bible, in Romans chapter 1 and Psalm 19, the Bible tells us that God's very creation tells us about His glory and tells us about who He is. So that's why we have the title. And this little slide here emphasizes again what I want this whole seminar to, this would be the same theme of the entire seminar, and that is what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. And if I can just prove that to you, then it's been worthwhile. Let me make a disclaimer before I even get started. I make no claims of being a professional scientist. Again, I do have an undergraduate degree in engineering and then a seminary degree, but I'm not a professional scientist. I don't claim to have all the answers, all right? And there's some questions that I guarantee I won't be able to answer. But I'm going to do the best I can, and hopefully I can show you that anyone that takes an interest in this subject and does some research, you can acquaint yourself with some of this information yourself so that you can be able to answer questions. And so with that, and also I want to give credit where credit is due. A lot of my slides, I've got a lot of PowerPoints here. They come from different sources. The majority of them, though, come from Answers in Genesis. They make those available. The ones that are really good artistically, I guarantee you I didn't make. All right, there's a few slides that I made, and then I got a few from other sources as well, like the Institute for Creation Research and a couple other places. But I'll give them credit before we even start. Normally, tonight's session is going to be on the age of the earth. Normally, I would start a seminar with the session I'm going to be doing in Sunday school tomorrow morning, which is entitled Philosophy and Bias, and talks a little bit about the bias and the philosophy underlying the creation-evolution debate. Because it's sort of a foundational session on everything else I'm going to say, but Pastor Whitmer told me that he didn't have any idea who would show up tonight, and it probably would be better to save that one to tomorrow morning. So I'm actually going to start with this one, but I'm going to start with a couple slides that I would use in that earlier session that illustrate this. Just a very simple concept that every one of us, when we look at evidence, we're going to look at that evidence. That evidence will be colored or swayed by our worldview that we start with. All right? And so everyone, is that my microphone or is... down maybe. All right, let me try there. Hopefully that'll be better. But every one of us will look at the evidence and we'll interpret that evidence in light of the assumptions that we already have made or assumptions that we start with. Let me give you an example. Let's say we dig up a dinosaur skeleton like you see here, and let's assume that whoever finds it is an evolutionist and they believe in an old earth and they start with that assumption. They will always come up with interpretations of how that fossil got there and how that animal died that are consistent with evolution in an old earth, and all contrary evidence will be explained away. Now, I've got to be honest as a creationist who assumes a biblical history. If I find that same fossil, I am always going to interpret that consistent with the Bible. And with this session tonight on the age of the earth, I would like to suggest, well, first of all, let me talk about this. I would like to suggest, first of all, that as Christians, the Bible needs to guide every area of our thinking, not just our theology. Obviously, we believe that the Bible has to guide our theology, but I'm suggesting that also when we talk about history or science or any area of study, we got to let the Bible guide our thinking. And including this area when we're talking about, is the earth millions of years old or is it only a few thousand years old? Did God create in 6 little days or millions of years? We also need to let the Bible guide there. And when it comes to the age of the earth, I will make a statement to begin with. There are no objective evidences that stand alone that show that the earth is millions of years old. Every dating method that the evolutionists will use to try to prove an old earth always starts with the assumption of evolution and with the assumption that the earth is millions of years old to begin with. In other words, there is no objective criteria, there is no objective piece of evidence that shows the earth is millions of years old. So it's important to understand that as we get started. Now, before we actually get into any science, I want to talk a little bit about what the Bible says about the age of the earth. Now, if you believe the earth is millions of years old, you first of all got to find a place to fit that into the Genesis account of creation. Where do you fit millions of years in Genesis chapter 1? And there's different things that people try to do. Some people try to fit it in between verse 1 and verse 2. They call that the gap theory. It's the idea that there was an original creation that was destroyed perhaps because of the fall of Satan through some catastrophe. Then there was millions of years and God basically started all over in verse 2. That's called the gap theory. And then there's other people that try to spread out the millions of years, maybe in the 7 days of Genesis chapter 1, and say that those days aren't necessarily literal days. Maybe each day represents millions of years worth of time, and so you can spread out those millions of years in those days. And there's different forms of that. That's called the day-age theory, but people that are progressive creationists or theistic evolutionists, which is a more general term, they would believe something very similar to that. But let me talk for a second about the word day. The Hebrew word is actually yom, but it has pretty much the same range of meanings as the English word day. And in this particular sentence, I'm using the English word day, and notice in this sentence, the word day is used 3 different ways in the same sentence. The sentence is, back in my father's day, it took 10 days to drive across the Australian outback during the day. The first use of the word day, the word is used in the sense of time in a general sense. In the Old Testament, for instance, you'll often read the phrase, the day of the Lord. That's not talking about a 24-hour day per se. It's talking about a general period of time in the future when the Lord will act in the specific ways in judgment, etc. So it's an unspecified time period. It sort of means time in a general sense. And then the second use, it took 10 days. That's obviously a 24-hour day. And then the third way it's used is the time of daylight as opposed to nighttime, or again, the daylight period of a 24-hour day. So in one sentence, we have 3 different uses of the word day, and you can find those same 3 uses for the Hebrew term. Now, having said that, though, let me give you some very interesting statistics about this Hebrew word yom. It occurs 410 times outside of Genesis 1 with a number. In other words, whenever the word day is combined with a number, like 1, 2, 3, whatever, every other time outside of Genesis 1, it always means, without exception, an ordinary day. The words evening and morning occur together with the word day 38 times outside of Genesis 1 in the Old Testament, and every time they mean an ordinary day. Evening or morning together with day 23 times each, again, always mean an ordinary day outside of Genesis 1. And then night with day occurs 52 times outside of Genesis 1, and every one of those occurrences, the words mean an ordinary day. With that in mind, look at Genesis chapter 1 and look at the recurrence of the words night, evening, morning, first day, evening, morning, second day, evening, morning, third day. It's almost like God is defining his terms for us right there in Genesis chapter 1. Matter of fact, he's basically saying, as you read through all those verses, he's defining a day as the amount of time where you combine the day and the evening, you combine them together, and by definition, that's a day. And then you take another period of daytime, you combine that with a period of night, you put them together, and that's another day. So basically, he's defining his terms right in chapter 1. A day is a 24-hour period of time. And if you read Genesis chapter 1, on the surface, there is no room whatsoever for millions of years. Let me give you a quote from a former Oxford University Hebrew scholar, a man by the name of James Barr, who admitted this. He said, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writer or writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that a creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the 24 hours we now experience. Now, that's a very important quote because this individual, from the tone of his quote, you can tell he's no conservative. I mean, this guy's not even sure that Moses wrote Genesis, so he's no conservative. He's a liberal scholar. But he's basically saying, he's not saying he personally believes that those days were literal 24-hour days, but he's just saying that whoever wrote Genesis, that's what they were trying to convey. And he's saying that as a Hebrew scholar, it's very, very obvious what the writer was trying to convey, and that is 6 literal 24-hour days. Now, I'm not saying that every scholar would agree with that, but here's a guy that's honest that says if you look at the Hebrew text, that's what it says. So therefore, in light of that, whenever you hear people saying the earth was millions of years old, Ken Ham suggests that, for instance, if you're in a classroom and your professor says something like that, you throw your hand up and simply ask, were you there? Now, I'm not sure that's always the best way to do it. I'm not sure that would go over the best in a classroom setting, but that kind of corresponds with Job 38:4, when the Lord asked Job, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding." And obviously, Job at one point in the book, he has a lot of questions for God because he has no idea what God is doing, and he wants an audience with God. But when he gets the audience with God, it's interesting, it's not Job that does the talking, it's God. And God basically asked him, "Job, where were you? Can you answer some of these questions? And if so, maybe you can talk." And of course, Job is silent at that point. When it comes to the age of the earth, most people do not realize that there are actually hundreds of physical processes that set upper limits on the age of the earth. Now, none of these processes give us an absolute age. Every one of them set limits. In other words, in light of these physical processes, the earth should be younger than this, and almost always the upper limits are millions of years or thousands of years. Very rarely are they billions of years. There's only a few that give billions of years. And of course, you never are told that. More than 90% of these processes give an age less than billions of years. Now, even millions of years seems like a long time to us, but you have to understand that the evolutionists, that's not enough. If they don't have billions, they don't have enough time. And so to the evolutionists, millions of years is actually too small. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of these dating methods, and we'll start with the ones that we hear about the most, which are the ones that supposedly give us ages of billions of years for planet Earth. And these are the radioisotope dating methods. And we want to talk about what they are, how they operate, are there any assumptions behind those dating methods, and so forth. And let's give you a little bit of the theory behind it first of all. Probably a lot of you remember from chemistry the concept of radioactive decay, where one element decays radioactively into another. The number of protons changes, the atomic number changes over time, and it decays into something else. Let me give you a quote from a biology textbook, a very dogmatic quote that says, "Using radioactive dating, scientists have determined that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, ancient enough for all species to have formed through evolution." Now, that's important. The biologists have to have billions of years. They will even say, if we don't have billions of years, we don't have enough time for evolution to occur. I will argue tomorrow night, if you come back tomorrow night, that even if they have eternity at their disposal, it's not going to work. But even they will argue that we have to have billions of years or there's not enough time. So it's very important for them that they have an ancient age for the earth. And by the way, let me say this before I go on a brief rabbit trail. A lot of the people, Pastor Whitmer referred to the intelligent design movement a moment ago, and those are basically people that may or may not be Christians. They're just scientists who look at the evidence objectively from a secular perspective and say there's evidence for a creator or for a designer. All right, so they're not necessarily arguing for God or for Genesis or anything like that. They're just saying there's evidence for design. Most of what I'll say tomorrow night, almost everything I'll say tomorrow night when I talk about biological evolution, those people would agree with. Matter of fact, most theistic evolutionists and progressive creationists would agree with almost everything I'm going to say tomorrow night. But when it comes to this question, the age of the earth, that's where we as young earth creationists, people think we've jumped off a cliff or something. I mean, that's where they think we've lost our mind. The concept of the earth being only a few thousand years old is just absolutely astronomically ridiculous to most people today. All right, so with that in mind, let me move on. Let me give you another quote, and let me just say this. Most of the quotes that I'm going to be using are from evolutionists. Matter of fact, if I don't say otherwise, it probably is from an evolutionist. All right, and it's good, I think, to hear what they have to say. But here's one that's honest, who says it's obvious that radiometric techniques may not be the absolute dating methods they're claimed to be. Age estimates on a given geological stratum by different radiometric methods are often quite different, sometimes by hundreds of millions of years. There is no absolutely reliable long-term radiological clock. The uncertainties inherent in radiometric dating are disturbing to geologists and to evolutionists. And so there's a guy that's honest and basically saying these things are not at all reliable. They're not consistent with each other, they give different dates, and they can't be trusted. Now, the way this works, over time, one example would be uranium decaying over time into lead, the parent and the daughter element. This is sort of a very simplified explanation of how this works. Another dating method is the potassium-argon method, where potassium over time decays into argon. Actually, more specifically, there's a series of steps in the decay process. In this case, you see the process of uranium-238 slowly over time decaying to lead-206. All right, and by the way, these radioisotope dating methods can only be used on volcanic or metamorphic igneous rocks, rather. They cannot be used on sedimentary rocks, and sedimentary rocks are the ones you actually find the fossils in. And that's something most people don't realize. Most people think that you find these fossils in these rocks, you can just date these rocks with these methods. You can't. Sedimentary rocks, you can't date them with those. So sedimentary rocks are a whole different ball game, and usually with those, it's kind of complicated, but they use something they call index fossils, where they basically date the rocks by the ages of fossils they find in the rocks. And you say, how do they know how old the fossils are? Well, it's because the fossils are in rocks of that age. In other words, the thing is totally circular. They date the fossils by the rocks and the rocks by the fossils. And once again, evolution has been assumed to start with. So, of course, you're going to come up with those dates. All right? So that's a very important point. Fossils are not found in igneous rocks. Sometimes you can find an igneous rock layer above or below a sedimentary rock layer that has fossils, and so that can help you. But these are volcanic or igneous rocks that we're dating. All right, so that's how the decay process works. Along the way, you'll see that alpha particles, which are equivalent to helium atoms, are emitted during the radioactive decay process. And with this dating method, there's three assumptions that we have to understand, and three assumptions that you have to make or you can't use the process. The assumptions are these. Number one, the starting amount of the daughter element is known. Typically, it's assumed that there's little to none of the daughter element already there. Assumption number two, the sample was always in a closed environment. If we're using uranium to lead, in other words, there's never been any uranium or lead lost or added to the rock sample over the entire history of that rock sample. Number three, the decay rate has always been constant over that whole time. It's never changed. If any one of those assumptions are wrong, then your date that you calculate is going to be inaccurate. We think as creationists all three of those assumptions can be wrong. The third one, the decay rate, was the one that traditionally we would assume would be accurate because traditionally those decay rates don't change, but actually in the laboratory in recent years, under certain conditions, they have shown that those decay rates can change. Furthermore, a lot of creationists think that during times of major atmospheric upheavals, particularly maybe the time of the flood, there's a lot of creationists that think maybe there was accelerated radioactive decay during that time. So maybe there's been a time in history where those rates were different. Matter of fact, these guys here, a group of creation scientists that are part of what they call the RATE group, which stands for Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth, they actually have postulated through some experimentation that there has been times of accelerated radioactive decay in the past. And I'll show you a little bit of their research, at least one example of it a little bit later. The second assumption is also very unlikely to be true, and that is that there's been no parent or daughter element ever added to or lost to that rock during the whole history of the rock. It's very unlikely that a rock would be in a closed system for 1 billion years of fracturing, folding, solvent action, etc., with nothing ever being added or lost. And the most likely to be true, I think, is the assumption that says that we know there's none of the daughter element there initially, or at least there's very little of it there initially. How do they know that? That's just an assumption. There's no way you can prove that. Now, let me give you a silly example of how these assumptions work. All right, you're in a college town here, University of Delaware. Let's assume that you have a class, and you go to the class, and maybe your class starts at 3 o'clock, and you're 10 minutes early, and you've got this crazy professor, and he's up there peeling potatoes, of all things, and he's got this basket full of potatoes, and the man's like clockwork. Every minute, on the dot, he finishes another potato and throws it in the basket. And then he starts with another potato, and 60 seconds later he's done, he throws it in the basket. And you're watching this go on, and you're timing him, and minute after minute he's doing the same thing. Now let me ask a question. If there are 20 potatoes in that basket, how long has that guy been doing that? Well, what would you assume? 20 minutes. But are you sure that's the correct answer? See, to say 20 minutes, you've made some assumptions. You have assumed, for instance, that no one ever added potatoes before you got into the room. Maybe the rate wasn't the same. Maybe someone else came along and added some potatoes before you got there. You're also assuming that no one came along and took any out before you got there. And most importantly, you're assuming that he came into the room with his basket empty. For all you know, he came into the room with some already in the basket, and if that's the case, then your calculation is going to be wrong. So only if all three of your assumptions are accurate are you going to get an accurate age for that potato system, or whatever you want to call it. And here's the thing. With these radiometric dating methods, we know that they don't work when it comes to volcanic rocks of known age. For instance, when you will date volcanic flows, and we know when those volcanoes erupted, you will almost inevitably get ages that are much, much older than the actual eruption. Let me give you some examples. Sunset Crater in northern Arizona, it erupted about 1065 AD, was potassium-argon dated at 200,000 plus years. There's a lava flow from a mountain in New Zealand, erupted in 1949, 54, and 75, dated at 275,000 years. Here's one in Hawaii. It erupted in 1801. Potassium-argon dated at 1.4 to 22 million years. Let me give you another good example, and that's Mount St. Helens. How many of you remember the eruption of Mount St. Helens? That was a huge deal because that was the first time a volcano had erupted in the continental U.S. And I was 14 years old when it happened. I can still remember it. That was 1980. But on the top of Mount St. Helens, there's a lava dome that exists there right now. And some creation scientists actually took a sample from that lava dome and sent it to one of these dating labs and didn't tell them where they got it from. And it was dated by these labs. And of course, we know that the rock is less than 32 years old because it erupted, at least the initial eruption was in 1980. There was multiple eruptions. But how old did it date? Well, one sample dated at 2.4 million years from a volcano that erupted in 1980. So the bottom line is, if they don't work on rocks of known age, why would we assume that they work on rocks of unknown age? All right, these dating methods do not have a very good track record when you put them to a test from samples of known age. This quote is from John Morris, who's the president from the Institute of Creation Research. He is a geologist. He said, when the same rock is dated by more than one method, it will often yield different ages. And when the rock is dated more than one time by the same method, it will often give different results. So totally inconsistent. So the bottom line is, if you base your theory on a wrong assumption, all your work can be correct, but the result will be wrong. So there's nothing wrong with the mathematical equations they're using. It's good science in that sense, but if they start with some wrong assumptions, they're going to get wrong results. And that's what I'm suggesting has happened. Now, those are the dating methods you hear about. Let's talk about the ones you don't hear about, which are the ones that give us relatively young ages for the Earth. And one example would be the Earth's magnetic field. The Earth has a magnetic field. It has a north and a south pole, just like any magnet that we're familiar with. But the thing about the magnetic field is it's losing its strength slowly but surely. Matter of fact, it loses about half of its strength every 1,454 years. They've calculated that. It's declined about 7% since 1829. So they know what the half-life is of the magnetic field. And there's good reason to believe that in the past, maybe that was losing its strength even faster during the Genesis flood. All right? But the bottom line is this. Only about 20,000 years ago, the Earth's internal structure would have been disrupted by the heat produced from the electromagnetic field. It would have been so strong. So that tells us that literally the Earth, if you assume that magnetic field is decayed at the same rate for all those years, then you've got to assume the Earth has to be less than 20,000 years old based on that particular dating method. How about the amount of helium in the atmosphere? I've already showed you earlier that helium is being released initially out of rocks or underneath the surface of the earth through radioactive decay, and that helium is slowly making its way into the Earth's atmosphere. All right, and we can get a good estimate of how quickly that, I don't know how they measure this, but they do. And they claim there's approximately 13 million helium atoms per square inch each second being introduced in the atmosphere, and theoretically only a maximum of about 0.3 million atoms per square inch escape our atmosphere each second. So all that means is there's a lot of helium being built up very, very, very rapidly into our atmosphere. But if you assume there was absolutely no helium in our atmosphere to start with, which I think is a bad assumption, then every helium atom in our atmosphere would accumulate in about 2 million years. So that tells us that, logically, the Earth has to be less than 2 million years old. If you assume the rate's always been the same, if you assume there was none there to begin with, you use the same assumptions that they use for the other methods. Let me further explain this a little bit. Let's talk about the helium that's actually in the rocks beneath the surface of the Earth. There's helium trapped in granites, more specifically in zircon crystals within those granite rocks. All right? And if the Earth is really billions of years old, almost all the helium should have escaped out of those rocks. Let me show you how it works. Here's the granite. Here's the zircon crystals inside the granite. And you have uranium to lead decay going on inside of those crystals. So you have uranium slowly decaying into lead. Now, the rate group that I spoke of earlier actually took some samples of some rock that they got. It was a borehole from a drilling in New Mexico. They got some of these granite rocks, and they actually dated these rocks with this method and came up with an age of 1.5 billion years for these rocks. Now, if they really were that old, almost all of the helium that was produced through radioactive decay should have already escaped out of those rocks. There shouldn't be any left. Okay? So the helium is escaping all this time. Theoretically, over 1.5 billion years, all this helium is escaping out of the rocks during this time. All right, so you would assume, if you measure the amount of helium in the rock, you'd assume you'd find about 1.5 billion years worth of helium, which would be just a little bit of helium, not much at all. But actually, you find quite a bit of helium still in those rocks. Matter of fact, rocks at a depth of 1,000 meters, 58% of it was still there. They measured it, and there was about 5,680 years worth of helium in those rocks, which, by the way, is about the age of the Earth that we as young Earth creationists would hold to, about 6,000 years. So that's interesting. 1.5 billion years worth of radioactive decay, and yet there's only about 5,608 years worth of helium that's escaped out of the rocks. Something doesn't give there. All right? And so that's a fascinating thought. Bottom line is, maybe there's not been enough time for all that helium to escape. Maybe the rate was faster in the past, and maybe the Earth is young after all. How about the amount of salt in the ocean? All right, we know that there's a lot of salt being added to the ocean each year from sediments that are, being added to the ocean from rivers and streams and whatever. They calculate there's about 450 million tons of sodium each year being added to the ocean, and only about 27% of this goes out each year. And if the ocean really were billions of years old, we ought to practically be able to walk across the Atlantic Ocean right now on the salt. Assuming that there was no salt there to begin with, and the rate's always been the same, that gives a maximum age of 42 million years for the oceans. Again, not nearly enough time for evolution. And I guarantee you, if there was a Genesis flood, there was a whole lot of salt added there at one point. All right, which would explain maybe the 42 million years number. How about carbon-14? A lot of people talk about carbon dating, which is something totally different from radiometric dating. It's not the same thing. Carbon dating is used on things that once were alive, things like wood, things like fossils that aren't yet, well, not fossils, but bones, maybe aren't completely fossilized yet. So something that was once alive, you can date it with carbon dating. But it's only good for things that are less than about 60,000 years old. Everyone will agree, even the evolutionary scientists will agree, that if something's older than about 60,000 years, there's no way that you can even date it with carbon dating because all the carbon-14 is going to be gone. There won't be any left. Here's the way it works. When something is alive, and breathing air or taking in air, whether it's a plant or animal or whatever, it's taking in both carbon-14 and carbon-12. Carbon-12 is a stable variety. Carbon-14 is the radioactive variety. And slowly over time, it decays, I think, into nitrogen-14. And so over time, it dissipates. It's gone. And so what you can do is you can sort of tell how long something's been dead by measuring the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 inside it. All right? And you can figure out how long that thing has been dead. But once you get to about 50, 60,000 years, there will be no more carbon-14, and you won't be able to take any measurement. So therefore, you should never find carbon-14 in things like coal, and yet we consistently find carbon-14 in coal. And even in diamonds, you still find, these diamonds here were dated with a carbon date of 58,000 years. A diamond, by the way, is the hardest substance known on Earth. There's no way you can contaminate a diamond. There's no way you can get something in or out of a diamond. Diamonds are supposed to have been formed millions and millions and millions of years ago, and yet consistently you can carbon date diamonds and get a date because there's carbon-14 still there. I have no idea how evolutionists get around that one. All right, that's one of the strongest arguments because a diamond is so hard, and yet you can carbon date it and still get an age. So carbon-14 in unexpected places, places we shouldn't find it, things like coal, diamonds, etc., we consistently find it. Furthermore, carbon-14, the accuracy of the method is dependent upon a consistent ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14 in our atmosphere. In other words, they're in a point of equilibrium. But in actual fact, that's not the case. Carbon-14 is still building up in our atmosphere, and they've actually calculated that it would take about 30,000 years to reach an equilibrium point in our atmosphere before it leveled out and the ratio remained the same. So that's another strong argument that tells us the Earth should be less than 30,000 years old because the amount of carbon-14 is still building up. So maybe, once again, the Earth is not as old as we're being told. Here's an example of an anomaly. They actually, I think this was in Australia, they found some wood buried 69 feet deep that was encased in basalt rock. All right, the wood was dated at 44,000 years by carbon dating, but the rock it was found in was dated at 45 million years. So you tell me how you get 44,000-year-old wood surrounded by 45 million-year-old rock, and how that works. How about the age of the universe? All right, are we being given all the facts? You know, when we're told that the universe is, whatever they're saying now, 13, 14, 15 billion years old, whatever the case may be. All right, let me give you a couple of evidences about the universe. Let's talk about the recession of the moon. We know that the Earth's gravity pulls on the moon, and the moon pulls back on the Earth, part of Newton's third law of motion. But this causes the moon to accelerate in its orbit so that it slowly spirals away from the Earth. In other words, it's getting farther and farther from the Earth. But no need to worry, it's only 4 centimeters a year. So that's not very significant at all. We're not going to notice that. All right, and there's sort of a diagram of how it works. Of course, the moon obviously causes the tidal bulges on the Earth and all that. But because of gravity, the moon is slowly spiraling away at 4 centimeters a year. Now, 1,000 years ago, that would mean that the moon was 125 feet closer to the Earth. And again, that is not significant. It is very insignificant. 1,000,000 years ago, however, that would mean the moon would be 28.4 miles closer to the Earth. 10 million years ago, that would mean it would be 284 miles closer to the Earth. 100 million years ago, it would be 2,840 miles closer to the Earth. A billion years ago, 28,400 miles closer. And 1.4 billion years ago, it would be in contact with the Earth. So obviously, that could not have been going on for all this time. All right, something has to give there. That's obviously totally impossible. All right, so again, that's just assuming the rate has always been the same over all that time. 1.4 billion years ago, it had been in contact with the Earth. How about comets? We're all familiar with comets. We know about Halley's Comet. It comes around every 70 years, and every once in a while we'll see a new comet. But there's both long and short period comets. Short period comets last probably about 10,000 years at the max. Long period comets last about 100,000 years at the max. And that means if the universe is really as old as we are told, and our solar system is really as old as we are told, all the comets should have burned up by now, because every time the comets go around the sun, a little bit more is burned away. Halley's Comet, every time it comes around every 70 years, it's a little bit less spectacular than it was the time before, because a little bit more of it's burned up or burned away every time it goes around the sun. So why do we still have comets? We shouldn't have any more comets. And what the evolutionists have done is they've actually come up with a couple things. One they call the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is supposedly this cloud of objects outside of our solar system that every once in a while spits another comet into our solar system to account for new comets, especially the long period comets. Now, no one has ever seen the Oort cloud. No one's ever observed the Oort cloud. And yet they believe it's there because we have comets. And because they are unwilling to consider an alternative, they've already decided that the Earth must be millions of years old. Well, the universe must be billions of years old. So therefore, they assume that there's got to be something outside of of our solar system spitting new comets in. They've also come up with something called the Kuiper Belt, which is supposedly outside of the orbit of Pluto, way, way, way out there, that is occasionally supplying new short-term comets. But again, there's no evidence for any of this. This is what you call a rescue device. A rescue device is something that you make up to salvage a theory that doesn't account for the evidence. All right? When your theory doesn't account for the evidence, you don't necessarily have to check your theory. You can come up with a rescue device to modify your theory to explain it, and that's exactly what they've done. I've already mentioned pretty much that. Again, it's never been observed. No evidence that it actually exists. Here's a quote: "Though the Oort cloud has yet to be observed, the theory accounts so well for the distribution of comets' orbits that most astronomers today accept its existence. And the definition of faith is an unquestioning belief that does not require proof or observation." That's a great example of a statement of faith. There's no proof, there's no evidence, but they accept by faith that it must be there because they're unwilling to accept the alternative that there's a creator. Carl Sagan once said this: "Many scientific papers are written each year about the Oort cloud, its properties, its origin, its evolution, yet there is not yet a shred of direct observational evidence for its existence." And that's a good admission. How about the formation of galaxies, particularly spiral galaxies? If the universe is really as old as we're told, we shouldn't see spiral galaxies. And the reason for that is when you take like our Milky Way is a spiral galaxy, basically they're rotating in a circular rotation, but the stars in the center are rotating faster than the ones in the arms. And if you've ever seen an Olympic speed skater, to illustrate how this works, you know, when they're doing that little twirl thing and they've got their arms out, what happens when they bring their arms in? They start going faster and faster and faster and faster. And so if the Earth, not the Earth, but the universe is as old as we're told, we shouldn't actually see the spiral galaxies anymore. Let me give you a quote from creationist Russell Humphreys, who says, "The stars of our own galaxy, the Milky Way, rotate about the galactic center with different speeds, the inner ones rotating faster than the outer ones. The observed rotation speeds are so fast that if our galaxy were more than a few 100 million years old, it would be a featureless disk of stars instead of its present spiral shape." Let me give you some other examples. This is an opal that you see in the slide, only it's not a natural opal, it's an artificial opal that they've created in the laboratory. And everyone knows it takes millions of years to form an opal, right? No, not if you have the right conditions. Do you realize that they've formed coal in the laboratory? Doesn't take millions of years, it just takes the right conditions. How about stalactites and stalagmites? How many of you have ever been on a tour of a cave or a cavern? And I hate this. It happens every time. What do they tell you about the stalactites and stalagmites? How long does it take to form those things? Millions and millions of years of this stuff dripping down. You know, it formed these things, and that's what you're always told. But that's not the case at all. Here's a quote. This guy says, Jerry Trout, a cave specialist with the Forest Service, says that through photo monitoring, he has watched a stalactite grow several inches in a matter of days. It doesn't take millions of years. Here's an example of a bat that has been covered with this stalactite material. Now, are we to assume that bat sat there for, I know it was dead, but that it sat there for millions of years without rotting or decaying while it's covered up with that stuff? It doesn't. There's man-made objects that have stalactites under them. It doesn't take millions of years. It just takes the right conditions. Let me move on to the field of geology for a few minutes and talk a little, and we're still talking about the age of the earth, but I want to look at it from a geological perspective. And just like there's a debate in biology between creation and evolution, there's a debate in geology between what we'll call catastrophism, which is what I believe as a Christian, that most of the Earth's geologic features were formed via a catastrophe, particularly a rather large one, known as the Genesis flood, and something called uniformitarianism. Now, catastrophism was really the theory that held sway for centuries up until maybe the late 1800s and early 1900s, when you had some men such as Charles Lyell and James Hutton who began to come up with this theory called uniformitarianism. Lyell was a lawyer. Hutton was an agriculturalist with medical training, but their theory basically is the idea that the present is the key to the past. Very simple. In other words, all the geologic formations that we see on planet Earth, we got to be able to explain through present processes, things that we see happening today. All right? So that's the idea of uniformitarianism. Now, if that theory is true, that means several things. Number one, the necessity of immense periods of time to form the present geologic features. In other words, if you cannot have catastrophes, then it is indeed going to take millions and millions and millions of years to form the geologic features we see on planet Earth. That's going to give, again, the biologists the time they claim they need for biological evolution. That's also going to make the Genesis flood of Genesis chapter 6 to 8 impossible. Because a universal but tranquil flood, and obviously if the geologic features were formed by the things we see today, then they were not formed by the flood. And I would like to suggest that a worldwide flood as described by Genesis 6 to 8 that was tranquil and didn't change everything is impossible and preposterous. All right? So you sort of wipe out the flood. And so if people hold to this concept and have any belief at all in the Bible, they'll usually argue for something like a local flood or something like that was only in the Mesopotamian region. And then by way of deduction, you exclude God from geology and then logically from biology if you do that. The late evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard scientist who probably was the most famous evolutionist alive before he passed away, he spoke of Charles Lyell, the founder of uniformitarianism, this way. Lyell was a lawyer by profession, and his book is one of the most brilliant briefs ever published by an advocate. Lyell relied upon two bits of cunning to establish that his uniformitarian view is the only true geology. The geologic record does seem to record catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted. Whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposes imagination upon the evidence. You say, why would an evolutionist argue against this guy? Well, very briefly, Stephen Jay Gould came up, him and a guy named Niles Eldredge came up with a theory of evolution called the punctuated equilibrium, which basically teaches that evolution was not slow and gradual. Evolution happened in spurts. In other words, there was long periods of time where nothing happened, and then you had short periods of time where it happened very quickly. And the reason they came up with that, they were trying to explain why you don't find missing links in the fossil record. And basically they were saying you don't expect to find them because evolution happens so fast in spurts, it doesn't leave any traces in the fossil record. So obviously if you believe that, you're not going to hold to this uniformitarian concept. So he could look at Lyell and be honest with the evidence. Now, in contrast to uniformitarianism, let me talk a little bit about catastrophism. There was a revival, if you will, in catastrophism in Bible-believing circles in 1961. Because before that time, unfortunately, if you go back to early 20th century, even in fundamental Bible-believing churches, there were practically no young earth creationists left anywhere. You even go back to the Schofield Reference Bible, the original one, there's notes in there about the gap theory. So there was no creation science movement. Everyone just assumed science had proved the earth was millions of years old. So almost all Christians were coming up with some kind of theory to account for an ancient age of the earth. In 1961, it was a very important year. That's the year that Henry Morris and John Whitcomb published a book called The Genesis Flood that would really begin the modern creation science movement. And in that book, they begin to argue for catastrophism, that no, you can look at the earth and you can find evidence for the flood, that the flood is what formed the geologic features, and therefore the earth can indeed be only thousands of years old. So when it comes to all these rocks, the question is, were they formed gradually over time, or were all these different layers laid down one after another as a result of a catastrophe? So when we're trying to answer the question which is true, and you say, where do you start? Well, let's just look at the evidence, and let's look at both theories and see which one best accounts for the evidence. Now, when you talk about the field of, oh, and by the way, this slide here just illustrates the fact that if there really was a Genesis flood, then all these different layers of rock that typically are interpreted as different time periods, each layer represents, millions of years worth of time or whatever. If the flood really happened, then all those layers would have been laid down one after another in short succession. All right? This is your standard geologic time scale that you will find in almost any textbook on geology, where you have these 12 different geologic layers. All of those represent sedimentary rocks, which, by the way, by definition, sedimentary rocks are laid down by moving water as sediments fall out. You have these 12 different layers. Now, you would think you could go outside and drill down and you would find all 12 of those layers. I guarantee you would not. That is nothing more than a trend at best. 2/3 of the world's land surface has 5 or fewer of those 12 layers, and 1/5 of the world's land surface has 3 or fewer of those layers. Furthermore, those layers are not always in that particular order. Sometimes they are reversed. Furthermore, if that whole column were present, then the thickness of those columns of rocks would be 100 to 200 miles thick, but nowhere in the world is it any more than 16 miles, and typically it's about a mile thick. So that is nothing more than a trend that they have taken samples from all over the world and sort of put them together in one chart. You're not going to drill down and find all 12 of those layers probably anywhere on planet Earth. So let's talk a little bit about fossils and the flood. All right, if the flood of Genesis 6 to 9 really occurred, and with that you would have not only rain, you would have all kinds of volcanic activity and tsunamis and just all kinds of catastrophes going on all over the face of the earth. If that really occurred, what would we expect to find as evidence? Well, we would expect to find, as Ken Ham says, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Now, my question is, what is it that we actually find? Well, we find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. That's exactly what we find. And that's what we'd expect to find. So with that in mind, let me talk about some geologic evidences for the Genesis flood. Most of these come from a book called The Young Earth by John Morris, again of the Institute for Creation Research, the son of Henry Morris. All right, let me start, first of all, with the worldwide presence of sedimentary rocks. I've already mentioned, by definition, laid down by moving water. They're all over the earth. Not only that, but there are marine fossils in these sedimentary rocks all over the world, including on top of mountains. You can find fossil clams on top of Mount Everest, for instance. How on earth did they get there? Well, that very simply means that all the world's land surface at one time or another was underwater. Doesn't necessarily mean it had to be all at the same time, but at the minimum, you've got to conclude at one time or another, every place on the planet was underwater because there's sedimentary rocks and there's marine fossils in those sedimentary rocks. And think about fossils for a second. When a fish, let's say by way of example, when a fish dies, does it normally turn into a fossil? What usually happens if a fish dies? Yeah, it's going to be eaten by scavengers. It's going to decay. I mean, a lot of times it'll float to the top anyway, so it's not going to turn into a fossil. For it to turn into a fossil, it's got to be buried very rapidly. And then under, the heat and pressure and all that, it can turn into a fossil. So fossilization is something that's very unusual. It doesn't normally happen. And fossilization is something that has to happen very rapidly. Look at this fossil. I took this at the Field Museum in Chicago, but notice that this fish is fossilized in the act of swallowing another fish. Now, how quickly did that have to happen? I mean, that had to happen instantly for that to be preserved that way. And so fossilization is something that happens very quickly. And so as a result of the flood, you would have all of these creatures that are going to be fossilized. Now, when it comes to fossilization, which is basically turning something that was once alive into solid rock, how long does that take? Well, everyone knows that that takes millions of years, right? No, not at all. Let me give you a quote. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen very rapidly. Here, for example, is a petrified ham. I guarantee you that is not millions of years old. And here we have some petrified flour, I guess in a sack. All right, that is not millions of years old. This is petrified fence wire. That's not millions of years old. How about this petrified water wheel? Does anyone here think that that's been sitting there for millions of years? Well, that turned into solid rock. And so once again, it's not the amount of time, it's the right conditions. They're important. All right, let me give you some more evidences. How about the existence of vast fossil graveyards? And what I mean by that is you can find places on the earth where you have millions of individual fossils, sometimes of the same creature like fish, or sometimes of a whole different slew of multiple animals, and all of these bones are all jumbled together. And you've got to ask yourself this question: what on earth was going on that all of these animals came to die in the same place? Did they all swim to the same spot to die, or did they all die in the same spot? How on earth did that happen? I'll tell you what, one thing that moving water does very, very, very well, and that is it sorts things of similar size and density, and they drop out at the same time and place. That's what moving water will do. So you have these vast fossil graveyards of all of these fossils in the same place. And then you have the existence of the fossil fuels, the coal and the oil deposits. We don't see coal and oil formation going on today, at least as far as we know. And we know that was remnants of things that were once alive. Coal is just remnants of vegetation. All right, all this vegetation had to come together, and it was under heat and pressure. It was buried and turned into coal. How did that happen, and why don't we see that happening today? Or how about the numerous examples of out-of-order layers in the geologic column, where layers that are supposed to be older are on top of layers that are supposed to be younger? And sometimes that happens with whole layers, and sometimes that happens even with individual fossils that are in the wrong place. And so how do we account for those? And also, keep in mind, what I've said so far, all right, I think is becoming more and more obvious even to secular geologists. And because of some of those evidences, some secular geologists, even today, are abandoning full-fledged uniformitarianism, and they're beginning to hold it to something we might call neo-catastrophism. And that's the idea that they're not going to accept, obviously, a Genesis flood, but maybe they're going to accept the concept of a lot of local catastrophes in different places. In other words, the geologic formations were occurring by formed by this local catastrophe here and this local catastrophe over there. And so that means that all these rock layers that you see in the slide there, one of them is formed, and then maybe there's a lot of time passes where nothing happens, and another one is formed. And so maybe your millions of years are occurring there in the gaps between. So as a Bible believer, as a young earther, I've got to find a way to sort of tie all those layers together into one depositional process, and to prove that they're all laid down at one time, a short sequence of time at least, one after the other. Okay? Let me give you a quote. This was a famous scientist, Dr. Egger, who was a prominent geologist in the United Kingdom, who was more or less a neo-catastrophist. He says, the hurricane, the flood, or the tsunami may do more in an hour or a day than the ordinary processes of nature have achieved in 1,000 years. In other words, the history of any one part of the earth, like that of the life of a soldier, consists of long periods of boredom and short periods of terror. All right? So even some of these guys are coming around and saying, all right, obviously there's catastrophes, and we've got to account for them. We just don't believe there was one universal catastrophe. So let me give you some more evidence as for a universal Genesis flood, and by implication for a young earth. First of all, there is no worldwide unconformity in the entire geologic column except at its base. Now let me define what an unconformity is. An unconformity is basically evidence for passage of time. All right, look at the slide behind me. On the top, you can see an example where you have a layer below and a layer above. And notice that the layer below has been shifted so that the layer above it is no longer horizontally right above it. Have you ever seen rock cuts? On the way here from West Virginia, and I forget where that is in Maryland, there's this one rock cut where the rocks are kind of doing the Watusi, and they do this, you know, it's just amazing. They've obviously been shifted, all right, and they're going like at 45-degree angles, and it's just an amazing thing to look at. But that's obviously an evidence for passage of time. Or in the second picture there, you see what appears to be maybe erosion. Maybe that was a stream bed that was cut out of that underlying rock layer before the rock layer on top was deposited. So that once again is an unconformity or an evidence of time. Now, on the bottom picture, however, sometimes they call that a paraconformity because notice that each of those layers are horizontally just stacked one on top of the other, and there's no evidence of time whatsoever between them, although they say there is. So that's the idea of an unconformity. And what we mean is that although there are places in the geologic column where clearly there was some time that passed between the rocks below and the rocks above, if you trace those rock layers on out, and most of these rock layers, by the way, like rock layers that you find in the Grand Canyon, some of those same rock layers you find on the eastern coast of the United States. In other words, those layers go throughout the whole continental U.S. They're huge. If you go out far enough, you find places where there's they're horizontally stacked below and above, so you can have one continuous process. This is the one I really like, the existence of polystrate fossils. Poly meaning many strata, many layers of strata. A polystrate fossil is a fossil that extends through several different layers of rock. Or maybe there's a coal seam, and then a shell seam, and then another coal seam. And you have something like a tree trunk that extends through several of these layers. And traditionally, the uniformitarian would interpret every one of those layers as representing millions of years. So are you telling me that that tree stood there for millions and millions of years without rotting, without decaying, while it is slowly covered by those sediments? That is absurd. That is not possible. The only explanation for something like that is that that tree had to be buried rapidly before it had time to decay, and that those layers had to be laid down one after another in succession. There's no good explanation for that. I don't know how they explain those. The next one is the presence of short-term surface features like ripple marks, raindrops, animal tracks, etc., in sedimentary layers. Here's an example of raindrop impressions in a fossil, in a rock layer. And obviously, how quickly did that sand or mud or whatever has had to be turned into rock for those raindrop impressions to be preserved that way? That had to happen very, very, very rapidly. Or these ripple marks like you'd see on the edge of an ocean, maybe where there's soft sand and the tides coming in and out form these ripples, and those are preserved like that. It had to happen very, very, very rapidly. And you have animal tracks like dinosaur tracks. Again, that had to be preserved very, very, very rapidly. And then you have deficiency of bioturbation, which is simply evidence of life in these rock layers. Things like worms or growing plants or clams that burrow down. And a lot of these rock layers theoretically were formed under the ocean. And if there was any time at all between the passing, the one layer was formed, then there's a bunch of time before the next layer was formed, you ought to find evidence of some of this. You just don't find it. It's not there in the layers. Also, you don't find layers of soil, which would be another evidence of the passage of time. You just don't find soil layers between the different rock layers. It's just not there. Undisturbed bedding plains. Those would be examples where you find two different rock layers. In this case, this is two Grand Canyon rock layers, the Hermit Shale and the Coconino Sandstone. And the shell was supposedly deposited underwater. The sandstone was supposedly deposited on land. And yet notice there's a knife-like edge between those two layers with no evidence of erosion, no evidence of, I mean, it's just like flat as a pancake. And that sure looks to me like the one was deposited right after the other. Or how about soft sediment deformation? This is an example of, again, this is the Grand Canyon area, cross-sectional area, Kaibab upwarp, where these rock layers, this series of rock layers has actually been shifted up. But yet the rock layers have not broken. And supposedly those rocks at the very bottom, according to the evolutionists, were, I think, something like 450 million years old when the shift supposedly happened. So they'd been there a long time. And let me give you an actual picture. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a couple of humans to give it the scale. But notice how those rocks are curving at incredible angles there. Now, I'm asking a very simple question. Can you do that to solid rock? Can you bend rock like that? What happens if you try to bend rock like that? It's going to break. It's going to fracture. So what's the explanation? Well, the explanation is the sediments had to still be soft. If they're still soft, you can bend them. All right, and you can get that. So you have two different explanations. All right, the older scenario, deformation long after the deposition, the sediments would have been brittle. They should have broken. Under a younger scenario, deformation soon after deposition, the sediments would be soft, and you could get something like that. And so that makes a whole lot more sense to me. Now, just a couple other pieces of circumstantial evidence which aren't nearly as important, but are just fascinating to me for the Genesis flood. And one is the existence of flood legends in cultures all over the world. It's, you know, we obviously read about the flood in the Bible, but cultures all over this globe have stories about an ancient flood, and many of the accounts are very similar. The number of people on the boat, the man's name sounding something like Noah, a bird being sent out. And let me give an example. These are ancient Chinese pictograms for the word for boat, which is a combination of the words for eight and people and vessel. And my question is, where on earth did that come from? And the authors of the book that I got that out of show several other examples of what they believe are remembrances in the ancient Chinese language of things in the book of Genesis, accounts in the book of Genesis. And there's also reported sightings of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey. And again, I'm not going to be dogmatic on this, but it's fascinating that there's been supposed sightings, and usually it's after long, hot summers when some of the glacial ice has melted back, and these sightings have been for years back into the past, but supposedly, and I'm not sure about that, but it's fascinating to think about. So I'm going to bring this to a close, and we've looked at the age of the earth from a scientific perspective, and we've looked at a lot of different evidences, if you will, from science. And we've just looked at observational science, and I'd like to suggest, from my perspective, at least in my opinion, it is better, the evidence is better explained by the Word of God, by the Bible, than it is by the secular assumptions that the earth is billions of years old. All right, and you can disagree with me, and some people do, but I think the evidence is far better accounted for by the Bible. Now, I'm going to give you, I'll probably do this every session, and I'm going to turn it back over to Pastor Whitmer, and he can close as he sees fit tonight. In addition to the table, if you're really interested in learning some more information about some of this stuff, I would suggest answersingenesis.org, phenomenal website. ICR.org is the Institute for Creation Research. Creation.com is the website for Creation Ministries International. And by the way, those three organizations, I think, are the three best organizations, the most reputable, and the ones that you can trust the most when it comes to creation science. All right, and all three of those are outstanding websites. If you're ever interested in going to the Creation Museum outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, I would highly recommend it. It's phenomenal. There's a website that deals with that. ChristianAnswers.net is more of a general apologetic site, but they've got a lot of good information on creation science from a young earth perspective. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Whitmer and let him close tonight as he sees fit. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Do you appreciate the presentation? Amen. I appreciate all of it, Dave. Thank you very, very, very much. You know, there's some parts I was pushing and trying hard to understand and think the whole uranium and all that chemical great stuff. And there's other parts. I'm glad for the graphic pictures. You know, the little, graphic cartoons that helped me too. I tell you, this struggle, folks, is a struggle that is not just like, I hope that you understand, how science works out to verify what you see in the Word of God. Really, this is a heart of struggling. Is it true, thus saith the Lord? Is God true? Is God creator, or is He not creator? This is a great struggle between light and darkness. And I hope that you enjoyed it tonight. I hope you'll enjoy it tomorrow. Some of you don't regularly come to Sunday school. I wish you would all the time, but especially tomorrow, please be there. Really the first session that he would have done tonight, he's doing tomorrow and continuing to build from there. So I'm going to ask Pastor Cruz if you would come and close us in prayer. Would you stand, please? Thank you for coming, and we will see you 9:15 sharp in the morning. We will start. Tremendous crowd. Glad that you're here.
Dear Lord, creation truly proclaims your glory. And Lord, we look around and we see your marvelous creation, and we praise you for it. We praise you for the details that you've put even into things like the flood that continually confirm that you have created all things and that you have a part in each and every day and how they are maintained. Lord, we praise you, and we pray that this conference will be used greatly to strengthen our faith in you, and Lord, help us to draw others to you. And we'll praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Before you're dismissed.